In a debate, it is essential to understand that it is combat, verbal combat. The point of a debate is to demonstrate a higher level of competency on a given topic in comparison to your opposition. To do that, you take one of two modes of operation in a debate: defense or offense. Taking a defensive pace in a debate is for the large part very unproductive, as it puts leverage in the hands of the opposition. They get to ask you more questions. It enables a capacity for you to make more mistakes by getting you to justify everything you say or propose. And overall, it just has you on the back foot. The only circumstance under which being on the defense is acceptable is if the opponent is visibly irrational, overly emotional, or just obviously incompetent. However, for the most part, the frame of offense is the best one to establish throughout a debate, as it allows for you to maximally display your opposition as incompetent. Now, that's for the meta analysis, but how does one actually establish an offensive frame or an offensive frame in a debate? What does it take? What best to do to get there? Number one, establishing requirements. When one is making an affirmative proposition, it is not only useful to make the proposition or the argument itself firm, but it is more so useful to also design the framework by which your opponent must operate to respond to your proposition, because then you would be controlling the pace and the frame. For instance, if I make the proposition that God exists and one of my reasons is because reality must necessarily be sourced from unlimited potential in order for it to exist, I can establish the requirements of what would be needed for the proposition to be questioned by the opposing debater. For instance, I could say, to even be able to question the proposition, you'd have to demonstrate how it is even possible for reality to exist if said reality has the capacity to be constrained in its potential impossibilities. And you're not going to be able to do so because it doesn't. This is not only a framing of the dynamic, but it also presumes certainty and confidence in the original proposition that I was making, which are necessary pillars of displaying competence. Number two, harp on obfuscation. Don't let go. Any vague notions, concepts, terms, or ideas must be dismantled and called out. Usually, people make claims and they presume the definition is accepted by both parties. To put into question for the audience the opponent's competence, you must not only ask for clarification, you must point out how it is not clear and how that lack of clarity would render the opponent incapable of making their point or criticizing yours, which would push them into clarifying their terminology. Everything in debate is a power play. You must utilize everything you've been given for the end of maximizing a display of competence. So, when you can tell that an opponent is using a vague term or notion, it is not enough to merely ask for a clarification, as that is more so collaborative. You're collaborating with the opponent. It is more utile to point out and dictate how the lack of clarity is a failure on the behalf of the opponent, and you must magnify that to the largest degree. Number three, search for inadequacies, then magnify. I touched on this shortly at the end of the last point, but it is not only in a matter of obfuscation that magnification matters, but in everything. Ask hypotheticals to determine inconsistencies. Point out presuppositions that have not been yet justified. Point out failures of a worldview, and most importantly, magnify them. What happens quite often, and I see this a lot in theist debates, is that the theist gets put on the defense and gets engaged in an interrogation, basically, wherein they're being interrogated by, say, an atheist, for example, questioning every response. And in any debate wherein one is making an affirmative proposition, especially an unpopular one, and they get engaged in an interrogation like dynamic with an opponent, it's important to at some point respond with, the reason for X must be Y, unless you're going to be able to tell me the basis for questioning it and why it must not be the case. So if I'm engaged in a debate about God and I say that God must exist because the source of reality must be unlimited potential, and I get asked why, I give a response without leaving room for further questioning of the proposition, because otherwise it just becomes a chain, an interrogation, a one-way street, wherein I'm just getting questioned. There's basically no way that I can win that debate. because I have exhausted explanation, and the only way to prove it to an audience against somebody engaged in a perpetual interrogation is to question the basis for their questioning. For instance, my response could be, God must be of infinite potential within the confines of my worldview, which is justifiable because I'm not aware of a possibility of reality having external constraints that determine its possibilities, unless you're going to be able to show me the possibility, which you haven't done throughout the entirety of the conversation. That's a great comeback. That's a great retort. It is a massive game of tit for tat. And the more you practice being on the offensive and phrasing your terms such that they put you at leverage, the more you're going to triumph in arguments and debates.